I'm delighted to welcome you now on behalf of UKLFI Charitable Trust to this webinar on the latest and most serious commission of inquiry of the UN Human Rights Council targeting Israel. I'm also very sorry to disappoint many of you. Our usual superb chair, Natasha Hausdorff, is tied up in court where her case first overran and then was interrupted by a fire. So I'm standing in for her. But we do have the real Hillel Neuer, one of the most famous human rights advocates in the world, with us this evening. He is executive director of the NGO UN Watch and has done an amazing job holding the UN Human Rights Council to account for its neglect of many of the most serious human rights violations in the world and for its discriminatory targeting of Israel. His speech in 2007, confronting the council with these failings, which they tried to suppress, became the most viewed NGO speech in the UN's history. His 2017 speech, asking countries that claimed Israel is an apartheid state, "Where are your Jews?" has been viewed over 11 million times. Hillel grew up in Montreal and read law at McGill University, followed by a master's in comparative constitutional law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He is a member of the New York Bar and practiced in commercial and civil rights litigation in New York before he took up his position at UN Watch in Geneva. Ladies and gentlemen, Hillel will speak for about 20 or 25 minutes and will then answer your questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A box, which you can open at the bottom of your screen. Hillel, it is for me an unexpected honor to be introducing you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And it's really an honor to be with UKLFI. If I think of organizations, certainly of attorneys doing the kind of important work you do, I don't know of any other organization in the world that does the kind of work you do. And I think your organization is a model, should be a model for other groups of attorneys who care about the same issues around the world. So it's really a privilege for me to be with you. And my sincere apologies for the delay. My fault. I think it's been one of those days for Natasha and also for me. But we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to try to be brief. I've been given about 20 to 25 minutes to talk about a lot of stuff. So let me try to get through as much as I can. And if there's things I didn't cover during the questions, it'll be my pleasure to hear from all of you. And I know that this is a distinguished audience, including some of our board members. And so thank you all for joining. My topic is the UN's Pillay Commission, the battle between normalization and criminalization. And let me begin with a bit of context before we go into this latest commission of inquiry that is meant to report very soon, indeed 2 months from today. We expect that they will report on or around June 13th. So that's just 2 months away. So a bit of context about the Pillay Commission, and that's what I've defined as what characterizes perhaps our times, and I'm certainly not the first to describe this. I've heard Tal Becker, the legal advisor of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, use this analysis. We live in times between normalization and criminalization, and the normalization is something that many of us have seen recently and have been inspired by, and that's the Abraham Accords, of course, something that perhaps we didn't expect just a few years ago, but to see an Arab country, an Islamic country, a significant country, embracing Israel the way that the UAE has done has been extraordinary. It's not just a cold peace like we saw with Egypt and Jordan, but a very warm peace, enthusiastically embracing Israel, public displays of affection. I mean, large advertisements in Israel saying, you know, UAE sending their best wishes, and tweets, and the Israeli president being received recently with full honors, and Hatikva being played in the presidential palace or whichever palace that was in the UAE. So all of these things are extraordinary. We saw similar things in Bahrain, also the Israeli prime minister visiting Bahrain recently, being saluted by the Bahraini military band playing Hatikva, and really scenes that we've never seen before between Israel and the Arab world. So they're extraordinary. And then, of course, we had the recent summit. You basically had an Arab summit in Israel, in the Negev summit, where you had UAE, Bahrain, but also Morocco, which also signed a normalization peace agreement with Israel. You have some tenuous advances made with Sudan. Sudan is a tenuous regime over there, but still some important advances were made there towards normalization. And of course, you have Saudi Arabia, which is unofficially, but quite well documented, that there have been significant advances made in ties between Saudi Arabia and Israel. They're not official yet, but obviously Saudi Arabia is the major player in Bahrain and also influences things in UAE. So none of the Abraham Accords would have been possible without their buy-in. So you have all of that happening. And then, of course, at the Negev summit, you had UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, you had Egypt there, which, again, it was rare for Egypt to appear in these kinds of things in Israel. The foreign minister who came, Sami Shukri, is someone who used to be the ambassador of Egypt in Geneva. So someone I know, and I wouldn't have expected. He was not a very friendly on Israel type of guy, and I wouldn't have expected necessarily to see him in that kind of a summit, but it's within Egypt's interests, and things are slowly changing. The Israeli president at the same time was visiting Jordan, meeting with King Abdullah. So during those few days, you saw normalization. Of course, we also have criminalization. And the lawyers at UKLFI know that all too well. And I'll just cite a few of the instances where we see attempts to criminalize Israel. And I would say that these, in international bodies, these initiatives tend to come out of Ramallah. I think that they are led by and coordinated by the Palestinian Authority, together with NGOs that are very close with them, that may be linked to PFLP and other Palestinian groups. And they are working together with the Western NGOs in various ways to criminalize Israel, which might be separate from, but is in sync with the narrative of Hamas, which is that Israel is criminal, the narrative of Iran as well. In fact, in a recent debate at the UN, I was listening to, it was the agenda item 7, which is the Human Rights Council debate against Israel. And I heard Iran speaking, and they were talking about Israel committing the worst violations in the world and apartheid. And then I heard right after them was Amnesty International, and the speech was virtually identical. If you didn't know who was saying it, and you were just looking at the words or listening, if you just read the words, it would be hard to distinguish the speech of the Islamic Republic of Iran and Amnesty International, which is rather shocking. And I can't think of another instance in the world where Amnesty's speech would be basically identical to that of a brutal, murderous dictatorship. Well, so I mentioned those pushing it, I believe, are largely Palestinian groups affiliated with the PA, working with certain Western groups. And they were able to achieve the International Criminal Court investigation into war crimes by Israel, which was a whole procedure to get the ICC to recognize the state of Palestine. And people like William Shabas, who is a law professor born in Canada and was in Ireland for a while, and I believe is now in London. He was advising the Palestinian Authority on how to indeed pursue Israel in the International Criminal Court. So it's very much, this criminalization effort is very much something that's done by the Palestinian Authority together with various Western experts who are of the same mindset to criminalize Israel. So we have the ICC investigation, which has already begun, ostensibly into the situation in Palestine, but it's understood that it's meant to target Israel. Those are those who initiated the proceedings intended to target Israel, the Palestinians. So that's one. Then you have a series internationally of NGO reports that came out in the past year. One was Human Rights Watch, more recently Amnesty International, that accused Israel of apartheid, not only in the territories, but also within Israel proper. So Israel is accused of committing the crime of apartheid. And you have other Palestinian groups as well saying the same thing. Many of these Palestinian groups are funded by the European Union, either the EU itself or its member states. And that, of course, you can read NGO Monitor, which has documented this very well. And I thank them for helping facilitate the premises of my current webinar. Finally, UN actions. I want to talk about UN actions. So I mentioned the ICC criminalizing Israel. I mentioned NGO reports criminalizing Israel, and now there's the UN. And here we're going to get in a moment to Pillay. So just by way of context, the Pillay Commission is a creation of the Human Rights Council. And this audience may know things about it, but just the basics. The Human Rights Council is a 47-nation body of the UN, created originally in 1946, then known as the Commission on Human Rights. Eleanor Roosevelt was the founding chair, René Cassin was the vice chair. In its early years, they did good things. They adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But over time, they got corrupted and hijacked by dictatorships, became a body not of experts, but of regimes. And many of the world's worst regimes joined that body to make sure they never get condemned and to shield their allies as well. So the members today of what's called the Human Rights Council, this is after a reform that took place 16 years ago in June 2006, when they abolished the old commission, created the new and improved Human Rights Council. At the new and improved Human Rights Council, the members, 68% are not democracies. They include China, Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea, Libya, Kazakhstan, Somalia, and the list goes on. Bolivia, Qatar, and Russia was famously just suspended about a week ago, which is quite extraordinary. It's only happened once before, but the rule is that the worst regimes get elected. They want to be there for all kinds of reasons. And certainly the Arab countries want to be there because they target Israel. The worst regimes are able, for the most part, to protect their allies. There's never been a resolution on China. There's never been a resolution on Cuba of the Human Rights Council. There's never been a resolution on human rights in Russia. There's just now been some resolutions on Crimea, but there was never a resolution on the fact that they just arrested my friend Vladimir Kara-Murza yesterday, one of the most brilliant and courageous human rights dissidents I have ever met. He was just arrested yesterday by Russia, and normally there's no resolution on the human rights situation in Russia. But there is a special treatment of Israel, and just very briefly how that works. Every session of the Human Rights Council has an agenda. They follow the same agenda. The session in September, in March and June follows the same agenda. We just had a 1 month, 5-week session actually. And the agenda has item 2, report of the High Commissioner, item 3, civil and political rights, item 4, situation of human rights around the world. And then item 7 is human rights violations in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories. So in other words, one agenda item for the entire world and one agenda item for Israel alone. No other country in the world has its own agenda item. Only Israel. There is no agenda item on North Korea. There's no agenda item on Syria. There's no agenda item on Saudi Arabia, on Iran, only on Israel. So this brings us to the actions of the Human Rights Council. I mentioned the agenda. Every session, one special day only on Israel. Resolutions, most countries ignored. A handful of resolutions have been adopted on Syria when they were on the outs, North Korea, Myanmar, countries that have become weak or that were weak. And Israel gets more resolutions than anyone else. Resolutions are almost half the resolutions adopted in the history of the Human Rights Council target Israel. What happens in these resolutions? Well, among other things, they create commissions of inquiry. When they have special sessions, they create commissions of inquiry against Israel, and we'll come to that in just a moment. And finally, they have experts. There are various experts they have covering themes and covering certain regions. They only have about 12 experts covering countries, and one of them is on the Palestinian territories. That would be fine if he or she would cover all things that happen in the Palestinian territories, but they don't. The mandate goes back to February 1993, even before Oslo, before the PA existed, before Hamas controlled Gaza, before the PA was sitting in Ramallah and other major Palestinian cities. And it's to look only at, quote, Israeli violations of international law. So it only looks at Israel. And the expert the past few years was Michael Link. He just delivered a report a few weeks ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, accusing Israel of apartheid. That was his outgoing, after 6 years, he finished his term, and his outgoing act was to adopt that which was said by HRW and Amnesty, and he accused Israel also of committing apartheid. His replacement is a woman named Francesca Albanese. She's Italian. She used to work for UNRWA, the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians. She hates Israel with a passion. This is her life cause célèbre is attacking Israel, and she has repeatedly equated Israel with Nazis. She's equated the Palestinians as being like the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, accused Israel of apartheid. you name it, she was just chosen, even though experts are supposed to be objective and neutral, she was chosen. So it's quite a farce, and indeed it is all tailored to condemn Israel, and you have major players like Pakistan running these things. Okay, let's fast forward now to the Commission of Inquiry. A year ago, almost a year ago, in May 2021, there was a war between Hamas and Israel. Hamas fired several thousand rockets, more than 4,000 rockets at Israeli cities. Israel responded, I would say, in quite a precision way. Indeed, the outgoing, well, he was kicked out, but the director of UNRWA in Gaza, a guy named Matthias Schmel, said on a TV interview, without thinking about it well enough, he said, well, actually, Israel was quite pinpoint and quite specific, and you could see that they were really, targeting certain things. And yes, some innocent people got killed, but Israel was really trying to be targeted and did quite a good job of that. And then he became persona non grata and was kicked out of Gaza. But the head of UNRWA sitting in Gaza acknowledged that Israel's actions were basically pinpoint actions. But the Human Rights Council did what they always do. They convened an emergency session, created a commission of inquiry, which I'll describe in a moment. Just to give the background on commissions of inquiry, there have been numerous commissions of inquiry against Israel. There was one in 2006 on the Second Lebanon War, Beit Hanun a few months later, when an errant shell killed Palestinians in response to attacks from that area against Israel. The 2009 Goldstone Commission of Inquiry, the most famous perhaps of all, where Israel was accused of as a system, the political leaders and military leaders deliberately intended to kill innocent civilians. It was a blood libel. Quite famously, about a year and a half later, Goldstone retracted that main accusation in the Washington Post op-ed, but the report still exists. 2010, there was the flotilla. The IHH terrorists came to try to go to Gaza, intercepted, and there was then a commission of inquiry, accused Israel of committing war crimes and violating international law, though another UN report written by Sir Geoffrey Palmer, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand, someone who I got to meet a few years afterwards in New Zealand, he wrote another report for the UN Secretary General, and he said that Israel's actions to intercept ships running the blockade were entirely legal and justified. So, but the Human Rights Council's commissions of inquiry are always extremely biased by the nature of the majorities and the system in Geneva, the staff people who write it. The Goldstone report, we know who beyond Goldstone the other members were, very biased people who had already condemned Israel in advance. But one of the staffers, and this is very important to understand how this works, it's not just the members of the inquiry, but the staffers that are selected by the Office of the High Commissioner, the bureaucrats, the civil servants, are typically extremely anti-Israel people. And I'll give you an example. One of the staffers writing the Goldstone report was Dr. Hrietje Bars. She was, up until recently, a law professor in London, Dutch-born. She's a Marxist law professor, very extreme in her politics. And she was spokeswoman for the European Gaza Flotilla campaign. So she's spokeswoman for a pro-Hamas propaganda campaign, and around the same time that she's writing drafts of the Goldstone report. So it's all really orchestrated and rigged. Again, not just the members, but the staff as well. Then we had the 2014 war, you had the Shaibas Commission. He had to resign because of his bias. He had done paid legal work for the PLO, so he was made to resign. It's also a ridiculous case. And we've had other inquiries as well. So this inquiry, let me fast forward now to this commission of inquiry, but you need to know the context to know why we are so certain that this inquiry will be entirely biased against Israel. So the commission of inquiry was requested, the special session that created it was requested by the Palestinians together with Pakistan, acting on behalf of the OIC. And Pakistan, the foreign minister, I think he just resigned because his leader, Imran Khan, also known as Taliban Khan, was pushed out in their parliament. But the foreign minister around this time was interviewed on CNN, where he talked about, he didn't say the word Jews, but he said, they control the media, talking about issues about Israel. And he said, yeah, they control the media. And the CNN anchor woman said, well, who do you mean? And he said, you know who, those with deep pockets. And she was shocked and did something that CNN journalists rarely do. She called out the Pakistani foreign minister on the spot for anti-Semitism. And it was crass anti-Semitism, talking about Jews with deep pockets controlling the media. And that's the Pakistani foreign minister. So the same Pakistan is the one that called this emergency session. It's an anti-Semitic government. And there was an article in Haaretz a week ago on how anti-Semitism is part of the discourse in Pakistani politics. So Pakistan called the session with the Palestinians. The resolution that emerged was not supported by any of Israel's allies, not a single Western democracy, not the UK, Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, Bulgaria, who are sitting on the council. None of them supported it. They either voted no, those countries voted no, others abstained. No one voted for it. No Western democracy in EU voted for this, this resolution. So the resolution 30/1 created a commission of inquiry to, quote, investigate in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, and in Israel. That's something new. Previous commissions of inquiry always looked at, actions related to war crimes in Gaza, primarily because the rockets came from Gaza. Israel would respond to Gaza. This one says also in Israel. Come to that in a moment. Well, they want to include things that happened in Jerusalem to try and say that it was Israeli actions in Sheikh Jarrah and things at the holy sites, the Islamic holy sites, that also Jewish holy sites, that Israel sort of provoked the rockets. That's kind of the reason why they want to do that. So to investigate in the occupied Palestinian territory and in Israel, all alleged violations of international humanitarian law, all alleged violations of international human rights law, leading up to and since 13 April 2021, which is when those protests in Jerusalem and clashes in Jerusalem began, and all underlying root causes of recurrent tensions, instability, and protraction of conflict, including systematic discrimination and repression based on national, ethnic, racial, or religious identity. To summarize, my friends, what this is about is going to be two things. Number one, like all the previous COIs when there was clashes between Israel and Hamas, they're going to look into the conduct of the war, whereby Hamas will get criticized a little bit, but 95%, and not just quantitatively, but qualitatively, it will be against Israel. And we know this to be the case based on all the commissions of inquiry that have come about from these previous bodies, I mean, the Human Rights Council and the staff that write it, which are organized by the Office of the High Commissioner, which was headed by Navi Pillay, and we'll mention her in a moment. So they'll talk about alleged war crimes by Israel. They'll accuse Israel of committing war crimes, and they will also accuse Israel of systematic discrimination and, of course, of apartheid. After Amnesty International, which is very integrated, their people occupy the top spots at the Office of the High Commissioner, which writes these reports, and Human Rights Watch as well. After their reports accusing Israel of apartheid, after Michael Link's recent report came out a couple of weeks ago accusing Israel of apartheid, it is almost certain that the Commission of Inquiry will do the same when they're investigating systematic discrimination. They will not look at Palestinian systematic discrimination, where terrorists have been killing Israelis in Bnei Brak, in Tel Aviv, in Beersheba, in other parts of Israel, and Palestinian media and Fatah, which is part of the state of Palestine, they embrace it, they celebrate it, like the father in Jenin recently. You could see memory translations of how they celebrate killing Jews. Their system has its own version of apartheid. If you sell land to Jews, you get the death penalty. That will not be, in my guess, will not be the object of their investigations. It will be Israel accused of apartheid. So that's based on everything that we know. Now, who are the people who run the inquiry? So there's three individuals. One is Milun Kotari. He was once the UN Special Rapporteur on Housing when I arrived in Geneva a long time ago, nearly 2 decades ago. And he famously went to Israel on a private visit where he wasn't supposed to conduct official business. But in the end, he wrote a report against Israel and accused Israel of all kinds of terrible things. That was going back some 20 years ago. So that he has a particular background of distorting Israeli actions, ignoring Palestinian terrorism, accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing. That's Milun Kotari. Then you have Chris Sidoti. I know him because he was in my building for a number of years. He was the head of a group called ISHR, and he has been associated with various groups that embrace the Palestinian cause and accuse Israel of apartheid. So those are those two, but the main one is the chair. The chair they chose is Navi Pillay. Navi Pillay, on its face, would be a very qualified person. She was the former UN Human Rights Chief from, I believe, 2008 to 2014, approximately. She was, she's a woman of color from South Africa. She fought against apartheid. She was a judge. So she has all kinds of things that you would suggest that she would be a qualified person to run this inquiry. But in fact, if you know a little bit about Navi Pillay, you would know that she's basically maybe the most biased person in the world, one of the most biased persons in the world that you could get to run this inquiry. And let me just share with you a few items because I don't want to do overkill, but who is Navi Pillay? and how does this fit into her neutrality? The experts, I should indicate that experts of the Human Rights Council appointed for a commission of inquiry are obliged to be impartial. Okay, this is emphasized many times in the guidelines of how you choose experts. And we did a petition calling on Navi Pillay to recuse herself. You can find it on our website. It's called a request for Navi Pillay to recuse herself on grounds of bias. And we cite the various UN rules which require impartiality. And they ask the experts when they're appointed, they're supposed to indicate if there's anything they may have said, any prior statements that would challenge, that would call into question their impartiality. You need also even the appearance of impartiality, which is standard for lawyers here, understand that, but the UN doesn't seem to do that. A few things about Navi Pillay. So she weeks before the war, okay, weeks after the conflict, okay, weeks after the conflict, in June 2021, she signed a letter, a joint letter to President Biden of the US, where she publicly accused Israel of being guilty of the very violations she's meant to investigate. So the war happens in May, and a few weeks later, she accuses Israel of domination and oppression of the Palestinian people. The letter entirely absolves Hamas or any other Palestinian actors of any culpability. The letter calls on Israel to address the root causes of the violence. That's the same language that's in the Commission of Inquiry, to look at root causes. And for her, the root causes are ending Israel's, quote, ever-expanding discrimination and systemic oppression. So Navi Pillay signs this in June, and a few weeks later, in July, she's chosen to head the inquiry into the very things that she's meant to investigate. In the letter, she talks about Israeli police and settler violence against Palestinians, forced dispossession of Palestinians, and refers to things that happened in Sheikh Jarrah from May, things that she's supposed to investigate, accusing Israel of discrimination. So she accuses Israel of aggressive actions by Israeli forces against peaceful protesters. And this is latest evidence of a separate and unequal governing system. She signed a public letter to Biden, lobbying him to take certain actions. So it's not just statements, it's lobbying. Prior to this letter, she's repeatedly accused Israel of apartheid publicly on video. In June 2020, so not even 2 years ago, she signed a petition. Again, this was a lobbying petition to, quote, sanction apartheid Israel. Again, it's not just statements. It's a letter that went out to governments, a manifesto, accused Israel of decades of occupation, colonization, and apartheid, equated the Jewish state with the apartheid regime of South Africa, endorsed an Israel's apartheid report written by Richard Falk in 2017. And it calls for BDS. It calls to suspend free trade agreements with Israel, ban arms trade with Israel, and so on. And on numerous other occasions, she's accused Israel of apartheid. And this is not even mentioning things that she did as High Commissioner, where she was considered so biased against Israel that a bipartisan group of congressmen wrote to the UN saying, don't reappoint her because she's so biased against Israel. She famously, at the time of the Mavi Marmara, her first reaction hours after the incident, before getting any facts, was to say that Israel shows perpetual disdain for international law. So, you can see our legal brief where we have many more pages on Navi Pillay, but she's basically one of the most biased people you could imagine to investigate the issues of war crimes against Israel or of systematic discrimination. We know exactly what her position is. She has lobbied countries. This could not be more unethical and a violation of the UN's own rules, and it's all documented in our petition. She should and must recuse herself. And it's shameful that someone who was a judge and a member of the bar in South Africa would, not see that. It's really shameful. So given all of that I've said, and now I need to sum up because I'm going over time, what should we expect from this commission? Well, based on everything you heard, we can certainly expect, based on who wrote the resolution, who they appointed, what the people, the staff people who write these things, the members of the commission, we can expect them to condemn Israel very harshly for committing war crimes last year, and to accuse Israel of being an apartheid state. This commission of inquiry will report in June under agenda item 2. Can talk about that a bit later. They actually don't report under agenda item 7 for various that. We could talk about that a bit later, about the UK and item 2. They will accuse Israel of apartheid and of war crimes, where Hamas might get criticized, but the bulk of things I predict will be against Israel. How do you fight back? I'm just going to mention a few things. I think we need to tell the truth on these things. So if there are generals who are experts on war crimes, should document Hamas war crimes and make the case why what Israel did in the last war is proportionate and legitimate self-defense against thousands of rockets fired against a population center. There's no other army in the history of warfare that had a more targeted response to rockets fired against them than Israel's actions in the last war. And a system of apartheid, that too, people have to make the case against that, which a very good case can be made, that there may be problems in Israel, but it has nothing to do with apartheid. Anyone who knows either apartheid in South Africa or who knows the situation in Israel, I'm in Jerusalem now, where you see Arabs everywhere. They're in the government, they're on the Supreme Court. It's really absurd. So I think we need to make the case for truth. And I think we also need to take the offense. We need to expose the war crimes by Hamas, which deliberately targets civilians, and Fatah, which incites terrorism, as they're doing now. And also on, if you want to talk about apartheid, we made a submission to the Commission of Inquiry where we document systemic anti-Semitism incited by Palestinian Authority institutions and by Hamas. So I think we need to make the case, and we need to expose the absurd bias and lack of impartiality by this Commission of Inquiry that is really, people sometimes complain. They say, oh, UN Watch or Hillel, you always complain about the bias of the officials. So, make it harder for me. Pick Christine Cerna. Several years ago, the Canadian ambassador was head of the committee that vets experts, and they were choosing the special rapporteur on Palestine. And that 5-nation committee chose Christina Cerna in Washington, who has no documented past on supporting Israel, supporting the Palestinians. She was an expert on international law. She was proposed. The Arabs wouldn't have it, and they wanted someone who was in their pocket. So try to pick someone neutral, but the Palestinians so far don't even want to take that chance, even someone a little bit neutral. They have to take the most biased persons, whether it's William Schabas, whether it's Francesca Albanese, whether it's Navi Pillay. And so I think we need to make the case that they've picked the most biased persons for these things. I've gone over time, and I'll stop here. I'm happy to take your questions.
Well, thank you very much for that superb exposition, Hillel. We've had a lot of questions. So I'll start with this one. Do representatives who are implacably hostile to Israel in sessions of the Council say things that are completely different in private? I mean, is it kind of ritual which people carry on, but everyone knows that it's just a ritual? To what extent is that the case?
I don't have those kinds of private conversations. I think I'm sure there may be some countries, for example, give an example, Morocco recently took the floor and read out a statement on behalf of the Arab group, which was a very nasty statement. And I think it accused Israel of apartheid. It was after Michael Link's report. And Morocco is buying arms from Israel. The Moroccan foreign minister was in Israel for the Negev summit. I see the Moroccan ambassador, at nice Jewish community events in Geneva. So, it's, I think if you could ask, there may be some governments that if you ask them, they would tell you, I have to read it because that's the political situation. But I haven't had those conversations with people. And some clearly believe it, from some regimes. They've convinced themselves, they've worked themselves into it. But I don't normally have those kinds of conversations with the diplomats. So.
Well, that perhaps leads on to the next question, which is whether the Abraham Accords have made any difference at all to the situation in the Human Rights Council, or whether you have any hopes that they will. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, the short answer is they haven't made much of a difference yet. I'll explain why, and then there's a caveat. So they haven't made much of a difference. If you look at the voting patterns in the General Assembly in New York, you will see that the countries that signed on to the Accords continue to vote against Israel as they did in the past, which will be disappointing for many. I'm not surprised because that's the norm for regular countries. countries like Singapore, which have extraordinary relations with Israel. I believe Israel may have helped train their military. They have great relations. Singapore, you go on our website, we have a website called unwatch.org/database, unwatch.org/database, and you could get all kinds of information about how countries vote. And you could take countries that have very good ties with Israel and they vote against Israel. That's the norm. It's terrible. It's demonizing Israel. It's demonizing Jews, but it's a fact. That's what happens. So if one were to ask the heads of the UAE and Bahrain or Morocco, how could you have such warm relations with Israel and yet vote against them all the time? I think they could answer and say, but you're asking a lot from us. We're now, embracing you in so many ways, but at the UN, we're now doing what countries, that many countries do. Those who vote no in New York, for example, are the United States, basically all the time, Canada, basically all the time, Australia, number of times abstains. And then once you get to the European countries, they vote, including the UK, they vote for about 3/4. They support about 3/4 of the anti-Israel resolution. So when there were 20, up until recently there were 20, the UK would vote for 15 of them, would vote yes. Okay, repetitive resolutions about the Golan Heights and Jerusalem and entirely one-sided resolutions. The UK changed their votes in Geneva because they said anything brought under item 7 will vote no. And then the Palestinians began moving certain things to item 2, which I've said to some of our British friends, I believe was probably a conversation, I'm guessing the Foreign Office had with the Palestinians saying, look, our prime minister has gone on record saying that the UK is going to have to vote no to every resolution brought under the anti-Israel agenda item. So do us a favor and move some of them to a generic agenda item, such as agenda item 2, which is the report of the High Commissioner, sort of a generic item. Move it to another agenda item, and then we'll be allowed to vote yes or abstain. And so the Palestinians have begun moving some things to agenda item 2, which the Americans, the Biden administration said, victory. We've now moved some things have moved to item 2, but not a victory, not a victory. Agenda item 7 is still there. So Israel is still singled out. And now there's proliferation. Now you have, at the beginning of the session, you have things against Israel, and then you have the agenda item 7. So it's not instead of, it's in addition to, and it allows a country like the UK to either vote yes or abstain. And that's why, quite interestingly, this Commission of Inquiry, when in the resolution that created it, says you shall report every year. I didn't mention it's perpetual reporting, which is maybe not unique, but quite extraordinary. And you shall report under agenda item 2, which means that a country like the UK will not be obliged by their prior policy promises to vote no. They could vote yes, they could abstain. And so that will be presented under agenda item 2, which is really interesting. I'm getting off topic, which the question was about the Abraham Accords, and somehow it was connected. But what I wanted to say was most countries, as I said, like even the EU countries are voting 3/4 of the resolutions they vote yes to. So I think we shouldn't expect very much in vote changes. That said, there was one thing a year ago where a resolution brought against Israel where Bahrain was absent. They were not there. Maybe the Bahraini ambassador had a cold, maybe he had some catastrophe, I don't know, but it seemed deliberate and that Bahrain was making a nod to Israel. I believe the Palestinians summoned the Bahraini representative in Ramallah for a rebuke because of that. So that was one sort of a one-off change. The other thing that I saw is in some of the speeches, the UAE representative had some nice things to say about peace, which they didn't before. And in September, there was a joint statement by Israel, Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, some kind of joint statement about, I think it was women in armed conflict, where they joined together. So that was something nice that they did together at the UN, which I didn't expect to see. So there are some atmospheric indications that there have been changes, but on many of these votes, I think you will expect the Abraham Accord countries to continue to vote that way in the near term. In the long term, who knows?
Which brings me to the next question, which is why do European countries support the Palestinians and go against Israel, even on these very dodgy grounds? I mean, is it anti-Semitism, or do they really believe that Israel is in the wrong?
Well, look, I think the people on this call, this audience, may have their own ideas on why the UK votes the way they do. Can you hear me okay? I'm not speaking through my AirPods. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. You're still coming through clearly. Good.
Thank you. Okay, so why do European countries vote against Israel? And I would say I've identified several factors. So one is, historically, beginning in the early 70s, from the 73 war approximately, there was oil embargo, and Arab countries said, if you don't, I think they began punishing the Netherlands at the time. They picked on them for some reason. And the Arab countries said, if you don't vote for us, we'll punish you and won't sell you oil. So the oil was a factor. Where sovereign wealth funds, countries will be told by Qatar, if you don't vote for our resolutions against Israel, maybe we won't invest in you. And we have billions of dollars, and historically, Israel did not have very much money. Now Israel has a bit more thanks to high tech and other things and gas, but historically the Arabs had billions of dollars of investment. Then vote trading, very significant. China, we're talking about Western countries, but I'll just mention China has 1 million Muslims in camps, herded into camps. There's no resolution brought by the Muslims on China. No one's brought it. China votes for all the Muslim resolutions and they vote with China. So it's vote trading. There are 56 Muslim states. You want their votes. You want their votes to be elected to things. Belgium voted for Saudi Arabia to be on the Women's Rights Commission 5 years ago. And why did they do it? And we know that Belgium told their ambassador, make sure you tell the Saudi ambassador that we voted for them. Belgium was running for the Security Council. So maybe they wanted votes. So you need votes. Maybe fear of terrorism. These, Jonathan, are all realpolitik reasons. Oil, money, vote trading, fear of terrorism, which we may not like it, but we can understand it. But if you ask me, do I believe that every time I see a European ambassador raising his or her hand to vote against Israel, are they being pushed by all of those factors, or do they rather raise their hand rather confidently, rather comfortably, and rather content to single out Israel? And I'll be honest with you, many European countries and their representatives seem comfortable condemning Israel. The reflex, the meme of condemning Israel, and that ties into, you asked about anti-Semitism. In Europe, if there was the Black Plague in the Middle Ages, it was the Jew scapegoated for poisoning the wells. And it seems that in modern times, if there's human rights abuse and if there's war and if there's racism, it's the Jewish state condemned, as figuratively as Jacob Talmon, the historian, had said, Israel is condemned as the Jew among the nations. And if you ask me, this inquiry, which is perpetual, it seems to me not just like a commission of inquiry, but like the Inquisition. And it's almost a European reflex, and perhaps it goes into religion of, the Jew killed our God and condemning the Jew, and sort of having the Jew there in the docket being condemned for their sins is almost a European reflex, which was part of European civilization for well over 1,000 years, up to 2,000 years. And I do think that Israel incarnates, that European archetype, that meme, that reflex. So I think it is effectively a new form of anti-Semitism. And it's not just at the UN, it's European governments funding UNRWA, which it's one thing to fund UNRWA for the humanitarian work that they do, but without caring that their teachers are systematically teaching their students about anti-Semitism, and they don't fire them. And European governments couldn't care less about that. I send them reports, and exceptionally, there are some action. There are some people in the EU, in Brussels, that are doing some things, but these are the exceptions. The rule is not the case, and the EU is funding tens of millions of dollars for Palestinian groups based in Ramallah to document so-called Israeli war crimes, to feed it into UN experts who produce these things as UN reports, and then send it. All of this is being directed to send to The Hague. I didn't read from the resolution where it talks about the point of the Commission of Inquiry is to preserve evidence so it shall be admissible in court. So it's very clearly that this UN inquiry is a kind of mechanism to help the Palestinians prosecute Israel, to produce UN-sanctioned 500-page Goldstone reports, to send them to The Hague, to prompt the prosecutors to go after Israel with the so-called evidence that they will produce, even if it's all tainted for the reasons that I described.
So why doesn't Israel or her close allies put forward resolutions against various countries? They may be voted down, but at least you're making a point. Is there a reason why they wouldn't do that? And should they be doing that? Well, what would you say on that?
Well, putting aside the Israel issue for a moment, I have a longstanding request, and I would say critique in this regard, in that our democracies for a number of years now basically never introduced a resolution that they can't win. And I think it's a mistake. So about 18 years ago, there was a resolution introduced about Chinese human rights abuses. It failed. It got maybe 12 or 16 votes, but it was a major cornerstone on the agenda of the international agenda. The international community was talking about this resolution about Chinese human rights abuses. China and its fellow dictators managed to kill it, what was called a no action motion, but they were on the defense, and that stopped. So certainly since the Obama administration re-engaged with the Human Rights Council, now the Biden administration, they never introduced a resolution that they can't win. So they do introduce resolutions on a number of human rights abusers. I mentioned Syria, North Korea, Myanmar. There are others. There was a resolution recently on Nicaragua. There was one on Venezuela. They are the exceptions. For a variety of reasons, the inertia at the diplomatic level is not to condemn countries. Let's be diplomatic. It's very undiplomatic to condemn countries, and you pick fights. If you bring a resolution on China, they're going to come after you like a ton of bricks, and many other countries. So the default is not to criticize countries, but we do call on countries to introduce a resolution on China, on Cuba, on human rights in Russia, and so on and so forth, on Saudi Arabia, which was just elected today, once again, to the Commission on the Status of Women. Breaking news, just elected an hour ago. Iran was elected last year, Saudi Arabia re-elected today to the Commission on the Status of Women. So they should. Now about Israel, should Israel introduce a resolution against Hamas and so forth, they wouldn't get any votes. They'd get a handful of votes. And actually what sometimes happens in the past is they can actually put in an amendment in the very resolution that you introduced. Palestine can introduce, or one of its friends can introduce an amendment, and they'll strip away what Israel put the opposite and get it passed by 155 to 8 with 25 abstentions. So I do think some resolutions should be introduced. On the Israel ones, it's questionable what if that would do anything.
I'm looking at what Israel might be able to do internally. Would it be helpful at all in addressing these problems for Israel to be more public about its investigations in relation to things that go wrong in the course of conflicts? For example, when civilians are killed in Gaza. Should Israel be more open and forthcoming, or is that does that only make it worse, or is it not going to make any difference and just give away potentially important information to adversaries?
Well, I think Israel should conform to the norms of enlightened democracies in its conduct of war and in its conduct of the investigation of war. And so I think certainly internal Israeli processes and external are entitled to hold Israel to account if there are investigations that the military does. And these are always criticized. In America, there's been a lot of criticism about that America didn't really pursue alleged war crimes committed by their soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan, and that's a vigorous debate. And that will always happen. It will always be the case that the military system will be defensive and will have a hard time in prosecuting their own. And you do need pressure by others within the system or without to push for that. So I think Israel should live up to the standards that are accepted among democracies. At the same time, as you suggested, Israel also has to be mindful that there is this entire global campaign to criminalize Israel that is not interested in actually global respect for international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions, in which case they would talk a lot about the Palestinians and how they deliberately distort and violate them systematically, not by accident, not that and there's a difference between a country that's trying to conform and that makes mistakes or that commits crimes, and a country or a system rather, Palestinian Authority, Hamas, which their entire system is based on terrorism and targeting civilians and placing their weapons in civilian areas. So because there is this global campaign to demonize and criminalize Israel, of course, Israel has to be mindful of that and not to strengthen them, while at the same time not hiding or diminishing internal accountability that is necessary for a democracy. So Israel does have to strike a balance, and it is not my opinion that Israel is less open than, for example, the United States is on the actions of its military. I'm not aware that they're less open than the US is, or the UK for that matter.
Okay, do we know anything yet about who are the staffers at the UNHRC who have been assigned to the Commission of Inquiry? And is there any way of actually finding out?
The UN generally is very secretive and is the opposite of transparent, which is a shame. And I would hope that the UK and other member states would demand more transparency from the UN to make it a more healthy institution. It's a very unhealthy institution. And so this is an example where the UN is completely non-transparent. They do not disclose who the people are. And the fact that we found out about Khricha Bars was by accident. It was an accident that somehow a certain document had her name on it and that spilled the beans. But they did not disclose it. And they should. Years ago, there was a UN Commission of Inquiry on oil for food. And this is going back nearly 20 years ago. And at the beginning of the inquiry, of the report, they said, we thank our staffers, and they listed, a dozen or 2 dozen staffers. And that's standard practice in other, national commissions of inquiry, which is relevant information to disclose. And they're the ones who write the reports. The commissioners oversee it and give the direction, but the ones who actually sit there writing them are the staffers, and they have not disclosed it. And it will tend to come out over time because they'll put it on their CV and in their LinkedIn, and it'll come out. But for now, I'm not aware who the staffers are. 1 or 2, but nothing significant.
And how much do we know about who they've been meeting with so far on this investigation?
I believe we know that I believe that they went recently to Amman, if I'm not mistaken, to meet with Palestinian groups that are targeting Israel and to receive testimony from them. I'm not aware of others that they've met. We made a submission. They didn't ask us for any information. We made a submission about Palestinian apartheid, and we've not heard back from them. So I hope it's been acknowledged. I have to confirm that it's been acknowledged on their part. I think it was, but you haven't heard from them. So, and I'm not aware that I am aware that they met in Jordan with Palestinian groups seeking to attack Israel. I'm not aware that they met with any Israeli groups or asked to meet them, to groups that are interested. I don't mean Israeli groups that are also interested in prosecuting Israel. I mean Israeli groups that are talking about, Israeli victims and Palestinian terrorism. I'm not aware that they've reached out to meet with any of them.
And another question is this: does it really matter? Do they have any real teeth at the UN Human Rights Council? I'm sure we just say shmum. They can say what they want, but we'll do what needs to be done.
Right. Yeah. So there is a classic point of view, as you expressed it, shmum, which was attributed to Ben Gurion, where Ben Gurion is meant to have said is the Hebrew word for United Nations. So shmum is the UN shmuen. Who cares about the UN? And I do believe that at times a country may say they have vital interests at stake. They're trying to, absorb hundreds of thousands of immigrants and defend themselves from attack. And if a UN body dominated by evil dictatorships tells them, oh no, you mustn't, do this or that, it's understandable why a country may say, the UN be damned, we need to do what we to do. At the same time, to say the UN shmuen, I don't care about the UN, it doesn't affect me, that is naive and not very serious. And very few people in Israeli government who are serious see things that way. On the contrary, the Israeli government is very mindful of these processes happening in The Hague, which the UN is part of it, right? I mean, or in London, when there was an Israeli general who had to turn around Doron Almog because there was a case being brought, I think it was a private prosecution being brought against that individual, or Tzipi Livni wasn't sure if she could visit London because of cases brought against her. And in many cases, in many instances, the sort of Annex 1 of the complaint against this or that Israeli political or military leader is the Goldstone report. So these UN reports are being used deliberately to empower, to feed and fuel lawfare, frivolous cases brought against Israeli leaders to criminalize Israelis around the world. And that is why Israel takes it seriously, and so do other countries. No country in the world wants to be condemned at the UN stage. Even the worst dictatorships, which you would think would be immune because they're dictatorships, why do they care? But the UN is regarded as the repository of international legitimacy. It is not good to be shamed on the world stage. It shows that you're weak, and it's a way to erode your legitimacy. And countries cannot thrive without support from other countries: political support, military support, economic support, trade. And if you're being treated as a pariah, you're in trouble. So look at Russia. I mean, Russia is the extreme example, where it's not the UN per se, although the UN did take some UN bodies, the General Assembly, adopted 3 resolutions condemning Russia and removing them, suspending them from the Human Rights Council. Today, Russia lost 2 elections. These indicate that Russia is a pariah state, and these can translate into sanctions and other things. So certainly the boycott movement that's trying to sanction Israel is empowered by all of these initiatives. So one could say we don't care about the UN, and it's true that some resolutions aren't immediately binding, but they empower all kinds of initiatives that seek to criminalize Israel, to criminalize Israelis, to make it hard for them to travel, and to ultimately erode Israel's legitimacy, and it erodes Israel's ability to defend itself. So these things matter. UN decisions are translated into every language. Like it or not, they affect the hearts and minds of hundreds of millions of people. And like it or not, what is said and done at the UN, maybe not every single utterance, but en gros, largely, what is said and done at the UN matters.
Yes, well, I would just mention on that example that recently we were dealing with, Michael Link, the special rapporteur you mentioned, wrote to all the pension fund committees of local government in the UK, who administer very large sums of money, urging them to divest. And we pointed out this was completely unlawful because it's completely outside the scope of his mandate. He was claiming to write as rapporteur of the UN Human Rights Council, but he had no legitimacy in doing so. Anyway, we've got quite a few replies from some of these chairs of these committees saying we also thought that it was none of his business to be interfering with our pension funds. But certainly we do see it all the time, UN resolutions being cited and UN Human Rights Council documents particularly being cited in student unions, in councils, in everywhere. So that is a major problem. And one of the things that people do ask, and I'm wondering what your view is on this, since you see it day in, day out, do you ever feel that the exercise is absolutely hopeless and that we will be better off if the UN was simply dissolved?
Well, first, I just want to address, you indicated how the UN can have impact in the UK, and you gave the example of the outgoing special rapporteur, Michael Link, who wrote sort of boycott letters to pension funds in the UK. The fact that your organization took this on in a serious, professional, and articulate way is wonderful. And again, I'm not aware of other groups that are doing this and taking them on in that way. So kudos to UKLFI, and again, more groups around the world, in America, throughout Europe, and other countries should follow your model and keep track of these things. It's so important. I forgot your question. Sorry, I didn't write it down.
The question is it hopeless? Should we just try and get the
right,
UN abolished?
Right. Is it hopeless? Well, the UN is not going to be abolished. So the question is hypothetical, and it's not realistic. So we could say abolish the UN, but who says that? You had Donald Trump, who was perhaps the most extreme isolationist, anti-international type person, and even he wasn't abolishing the UN. George W. Bush didn't abolish the UN. So who's going to abolish the UN? It's not being abolished. And for now, the countries that might be sympathetic, potentially, maybe, the English-speaking countries or something. Well, the US has the veto. They kind of like it. The UK has the veto. They like that too. They're rather comfortable there. And no one's abolishing the UN, right? It's not going away. So we could talk about it, and it wouldn't really solve the problem, because you wouldn't have the UN. Well, you'd have the ICC. You'd have, the signatories of the Geneva Conventions meeting to condemn Israel. They only meet a few times in their history to condemn Israel. And you have FIFA, which is the football, what we call in America soccer, their federation, and there have been initiatives there to boycott Israel. So the movement to boycott Israel will find its international institutions, and we can't eliminate all the international institutions. The anti-Israel forces will seek to corrupt every institution they could get their hands on. They're corrupting, they're hijacking unions, whether it's labor unions or student unions and other things. And we can't abolish all these institutions. They're institutions of society. So there is no easy magic bullet to abolish this body because it's going against Israel, or for Israel not to participate in it. It's a dilemma, but I think that Israel needs to be there because Israel wants to be a sovereign state, and the most notable manifestation of that is appearing at the UN and being a UN recognized member state. And Abba Eban and his team fought very hard for the vote in 1947 on November 29th, and then 2 years later in 1949 to be admitted as a member state. The Israel's enemies would like nothing more than to see Israel walk out of the UN. They would clap in victory. So walking out of the UN won't help it. Doesn't mean Israel has to participate in every inquiry. They're not cooperating with the Pillay inquiry. They did not cooperate with the Durban conferences, and that's okay. You can find certain one-off mechanisms to say, I refuse to legitimize you, but to give up on being at this extraordinary international institution, which despite its many flaws, and we document their many flaws, it's the only institution where all countries sit around the table and talk and once in a while cooperate on good things and have that forum. So the UN is not hopeless. I mean, the example is the UK changed their votes in London. The UK now votes no on the resolutions brought against Israel under agenda item 7. Okay, they move things to item 2. They don't vote no, but under item 7 they vote no. That's a change. And there have been some changes in New York where Germany and Czech Republic on a few resolutions changed their votes to vote no. So it's not hopeless. Groups have to do the work to make the case for balance and against bias. And there's no easy solution to that. We just have to do the work. And it's hard when you see some of that bias so endemic in society from headlines that come out. So there is a bias in Western society and other countries against Israel, and it manifests itself in government policy, but also in other places as well.
Well, we've come to the end of our hour, I'm afraid, and obviously we could go on for much longer, but we keep our webinar strictly to an hour because everyone is busy. But I'd just like to mention that there's lots more information on the UN Watch website, and you can subscribe to their email service, which will keep you in touch with what is going on and what UN Watch is doing. And I'd also like to mention that the Dutch organization Think, who are our good friends, have just produced a briefing paper on this Commission of Inquiry, and they put a link to that in the chat. So that is well worth reading for further information about this particular Commission of Inquiry. And I'd like to thank you, Hillel, enormously for all the work you do and for this fascinating webinar. And thank the audience for attending, and apologies again for the fact that it has been delayed, and the fact that I've had to stand in for Natasha. And just to say that also that our next webinar is on the 1st of May, and we'll be discussing very important issues relating to Iran with an excellent panel also for that meeting. So until then, thank you very much, and keep well and have a good evening.
Thank you. And apologies again for the delay. My pleasure.